I phoned a social worker and I made a great mistake. I said, I have a particularly deserving case.
Oh, yes. So there's increasing support in the EU, for example, for schemes such as a universal basic income. And, you know, you just made an argument that, at least from one perspective, could be viewed as supportive of a scheme like that, given that if you have a dearth of material resources, a dearth of money, you're much more vulnerable to catastrophe. And so you might think, well, if we grant people a minimum basic income, that eradicates that problem. But you also tie the degeneration that you saw, which I want to talk about more, to the rise of the welfare state. And one of the things that, and I think this is because of my clinical experience, and it isn't clear to me that giving people money actually solves the problem of poverty. Because poverty is very much more complex than the mere lack of money, even though that's certainly a cardinal element of poverty. And that's the other thing I would say, or another thing that you pushed at constantly in your writings, is that there's an entire worldview that is associated with violent and catastrophic poverty. And that's not precisely an economic issue, even though economic issues might exaggerate its danger. So tell us some stories and tell us what you concluded from what you watched.
Well, I concluded that we had created quite a lot of people who had nothing to hope for and nothing to fear, conceive of a life different from the life they had. Going to work wouldn't make much difference to them economically, as failing to go to work would not make much difference to them. This isn't actually a necessary aspect of the welfare state. After all, Britain was far worse in these respects than other countries which have welfare states, in some cases more generous than the British welfare state. But the British welfare state created a class of people who were permanently in this condition and had no real incentive to get out of it. This created it created sometimes a lassitude, but it was also dishonest. It created a kind of dishonesty because actually the more problems they made for themselves, the more they were rewarded. I remember we had a peculiar demoralization of the world. I don't mean, I mean actual removal of morality from all human consideration. I remember once I had a patient with multiple sclerosis, and her husband worked, but he didn't earn a lot of money, and she had multiple sclerosis, which was clearly not her fault. And they needed some adjustments to their house so that she could get out of the house more easily and so on. And it seemed to me this, as far as I'm concerned, that's a perfectly good way to, well, this is a place where the welfare state could actually help. So I phoned a social worker and I made a great mistake. I said, I have a particularly deserving case.
Oh, yes.
And there was a stony silence on the other end. And then she said that all cases were deserving. In other words, you couldn't distinguish between this case of need, which was just one of those things, it was nobody's fault, and someone who took drugs, set fire to his house in a state of intoxication. There was no difference. And since, of course, people who behave badly become more needy, they actually gain more attention and more sympathy. That's if you take desert away, if you remove desert from all considerations. And this means that actually one source of meaning in life is completely removed. And what we saw with these people who had no religion.
Inverted even. That's the case you're making. It's not even just removed, it's actually punished, actively punished.
Yeah.
Which is even worse than mere removal.
Yes.
So, and you kind of claim, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there's a perverse attractiveness of that to the educated helping classes in producing a group of people who are so much beneath them in some sense that normal moral standards don't anymore apply. And what that means, I mean, if that's the case, that perverse sense of superiority and the moral gratification that might provide, if that's the case, then people are being actively punished for doing anything that might lift them out of the circumstances that they find themselves in.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that is clear about the, shall I say, the intellectual classes is one of their greatest fears is the fear of being considered censorious. And of course, censoriousness is not a very attractive quality. So, but the best way to avoid being considered censorious is to fail to make any judgment whatever. But this is completely impossible. It's impossible to not to make judgments. Judgment is part of being human.